decorating on flat surfaces, right, using slips. So we've got my flocculated stuff, I've got a bunch of colored slips, I've got black slip behind me should I need it, and I've got a slab roll down. Does everyone know how the slab roller works? If not, I'd be happy to do a little, okay, let's do a little slab roller 101, right? So I have all my slabs, we have these like slab gauges, right? You use these because if you just kind of look at the markings on the side here and try to figure out how thick your slab is, a lot of times it ends up thicker or thinner than you need it to. You can put these under and that'll give you like a pretty close approximation of what that actual thickness is. For all of my work and the like flatware we do for the studio, I do 5/16. I find that to be the thickness where things still feel sturdy but they don't feel heavy, right? Heaviness is like usually a thing I associate with like not refined. Do you know what I mean? So, let's see how close we were. So pretty close here, right? So what I usually do is I spin this until I close one side down until my 5/16 doesn't fit, right? And then I open it up slowly until it fits and I can skate all the way to the edge, right? And I don't want it to click very much when I do like the up and down there. I want it to kind of barely fit. Then we'll move over to the other side. Close this one down as well. Until it doesn't fit, open it up till it barely fits. And I can reach the edge. And then to skate across the whole thing, it gets a little difficult here, so I'm going to raise it up just a bit more. That way we don't end up with a slab that's like real thick on one side and open. Right? That's your first step. Your second step would be it always takes more clay than you think it does to make a decent sized slab, right? So what I did is I took a block of my clay and I stretched it out one way by sort of just taking it, lifting it up, and throwing it back towards myself over and over and over again. That'll elongate it in one direction, right? We don't need to elongate it in the other direction because that's what the slab roller is for. So I usually will pick a side and kind of hammer it down. That's going to be my loading side, right? This is kind of just like a sort of a ramp. That way it's not just moving a ton of clay through this thing at once, right? So I'm going to take this very gently. Actually, don't do this yet. There's one more step I got to do real quick. So now that we have the gauge set, we're using brown clay, so grab one of these ones that's like pretty obviously dyed red. You know what I mean? Put it in fold side first. You want to get it in there maybe like an inch or two, right? You want to be able to pull it on the other side should you need to. Then you're going to take the top half, throw it over like that. And now what we're going to do is grab our slab, again with the sort of beveled side first. The beveled side goes forward like this. If you put this in long ways, you would just end up with a really, really long, useless slab, right? And what we're looking for is kind of like a square or circular shape. That'll give us the most versatility when it comes to making actual forms, right? So you fold that back over, push this until that bevel reaches the actual press here, and then smooth, consistent motions. You're just going to roll it out like so. Once that comes out, you'll have roughly rectangle, squarish shape, right? Let's see if I can, you guys see that over there? Kinda. Oh, slab. This is what we're shooting for, right? From here I can use, like this would be a really great mold or a slab if I was gonna make like a platter or something. If I was gonna do something round, I could probably only do something this big, right? So what we're gonna do now is de-texture it. So the way I found the easiest to get this off of the board or off of the actual canvas and onto a board is to slide something larger than it underneath. And then we've got a bunch of these kind of big bats for this reason, that's why they live here. Put another one on top, kind of sandwich those, pull the board out towards you. And then this is how you flip most things in furnace, right? You kind of go up and over. Once you up and over, set this back down. Remove all the stuff that you put on it, and now you have a transportable slab. One downside to the slab roller is it's got all these like little kind of teeth marks in here, which is great for gripping, but bad because it leaves kind of a weird texture on your slab. So the first thing I do before I do any decorating is get rid of that texture. I'll move this to here so we can see what's going on. So for texture removal, we really need a sprayer, if you don't mind.
How many pounds of clay was that about?
I didn't actually measure it. You know, if I had to guesstimate, this one's probably like 3 pounds, and then this big slab's probably like 4 to 5 pounds. Thanks very much. So I really don't love canvas texture, so hey, you can leave it if you want. That's just a thing that, like, in most of the studios I've worked in, and even in school, like, it feels, I guess it like seems lazy. Do you know what I mean? I don't actually mind canvas texture in my own work too much, but it's like one more step that just shows that you had intention the whole way through, right? As far as like finished, like contemporary American ceramics goes. So you spray it with water. You take one of these scrapey guys. You basically just scrape out that texture. And I usually do this in 2 directions just to really make sure I get it all nice and smooth. This will also show you if you have any weird air bubbles or anything in your slab. So if you're using reclaim to make slabs, you'll probably have some kind of bubble or something in there you need to get rid of. And they usually pop up right now. So, now that that's all cleaned up, we can move on to decorating. So for this guy, what mold am I going to use? We're going to use that one. So, if you haven't seen them, we've got a ton of either plaster or bisque molds right on the other side of this. There's also the wooden molds, which you guys are more than welcome to use, right? This is called a hump mold because it's kind of like, put it on your back, it looks like you have a hump on your back, right? You hump things over it. And then there are slump molds where you slump the clay into it. This would be an example of one, right? This one I made, you can slump or you can hump, right? You can sort of flip it however you need to flip it. Kind of same thing with these guys. These are slump molds where you would put the clay, kind of drape it into the form. And then another version of a slump mold is a ring mold, which we only have one of in the studio because I donated it, but if anyone's super interested in learning how to make these, I can show you. It's just kind of like a whole other process, right? So I usually do decoration on flat surfaces, because it's more fun to decorate on flat as opposed to like having to work around the curves of a pot when you're decorating. And then also I usually hand build plates and bowls and things like that because I find it fun, right? It's I can throw bowls, I can throw plates. Hand building plates and bowls is much more fun to me. It's much more enjoyable. So what are we gonna do? I'm gonna start out by putting, I think, some black slip all over this because we're gonna add some of that thickened slip on top of that and maybe some colors on top of that, right? So I've got my black slip back here. Move that so it's a bit closer. We'll put it down here. And again, I'm going to try to speed through this process. Most of this process would take you hours because you'd be doing a layer, putting the whole slab outside, waiting for that layer to dry, doing another layer, putting it outside, waiting for that layer to dry. I'm going to try to do thin coats so I don't necessarily have to do that. And then I'm also going to implement a blowtorch to hopefully emulate the sun. So I really don't mind if this is kind of streaky here. We're going to do multiple layers, and I don't mind if the actual clay body peeks through the bottom layer, right? I think it's kind of interesting to show we're not just totally trying to hide what we've done. Kind of trying to accentuate it and just add more visual interest than just having like a brown piece, you know what I mean? And you can crosshatch these. Best, if you wanted a really thick coat, right? Or a really solid coat, what you would do is do it one way, put it outside, let it dry, do it the other way. You do 3 coats, right? Sort of cross-hatching coats. Similar things apply to if you use underglaze. This slip's really good in that your pieces sometimes will survive if you dip them at bone dry or if you dip them at bisque. I don't recommend that until you like know exactly what you're doing. For the most part, all slip work needs to happen at leather hard or fresh, right? Leather hard's probably your best bet, right? But from here, you can switch over to using any sort of colored slips you want, right? I really like, let's actually start with some of this stuff. So this is our thickened up kind of flocculated slip, right? Let me grab some kind of brush I think will work well for this. Fan brush might work. I kind of want to see how well this decorates now too. Because what I want it to do is leave pretty thick sort of globs on there. And I'm just going to do a bunch of squares. Let's actually do some black trailing over that. Usually do sort of just a demo run. So, and we'll actually do some white trailing as well. just to make it look a little looser, right? I think it's just a little bit more visually interesting. When you try really hard with slip to get like very tight patterns, that ends up looking kind of splotchy and weird, right? So for now, what I'm going to do is I am going to wait for this one to dry, and then I will try to get it situated in one of our molds. So we might have to do this demo in 2 parts, just to sort of show you. But this is the first part, the actual decorating part. I'm going to cut here, and then we'll sort of meet up in a little bit, and I'll show you how I would use, I'll do another one too, just to have 2 examples. I'll show you how I would use this in a slump form, and then also in a hump form, okay? All right, so I've got most of my decoration done on this guy. I put it outside to dry for a while. The sun works wonders, and it actually dried out pretty quickly, right? One thing I wanted to go over is how to use these, what I call porcelain stones, right? This is basically just unfired pieces of colored slip that I've made in the past that I've just kept as unfired pieces so that I could crumble them up into little bits. And one thing I like to do on some of these is give myself little pockets of these porcelain stones. Just adds a little bit more visual interest, and then I will probably inlay some black underglaze around these in the either bone dry or bisque fired stage. All these words will make much more sense as the weeks go along. Okay? So basically all I did is I took, these are all different colors, but like this one is probably red. Take them, smash them, make them a little bit smaller, a little bit more manageable, and then we'll just sprinkle. This just adds a little bit more visual interest to the background. Now, because all that is sort of a 3D element that I've added, what I need to do is use newsprint.
Oh, slab roll.
Slab roll there we go. I'm going to cover my piece in newsprint. And then I'm going to use some sort of rolling device, like one of these guys, to slowly but surely roll those porcelain stones into my actual slab. That way they're flush when I go to transfer it. So let's peel this up now. Everything's nice and pressed in. We will still lose some of this as we like flip stuff over and do that whole jazz, but I'm fine with that. Now we're going to do this one on a hump mold, like so, right? So what I like to do there is line up my hump. This one isn't the perfect shape for the fact that my slab is kind of rectangular, right? So you can go through them. I think I still want to do it because I like the shape of this. It makes a really nice plate. You kind of choose where you're going to get the most coverage. I think right here's probably my best bet. Set that down. And then I usually just flip the whole thing over like so. Set my hump mold down on something that spins. And then slowly but surely try to coax off my slab, like so. You can see I've got a bunch of extra slab in some parts and not enough in others. That's fine. On any sort of hump mold, I never try to get it all the way to the edge because I know more often than not I'm not going to be able to reach that. So set this down here. I'm going to grab some water. And then I need a needle tool, which I'm sure I have floating around here somewhere. Marvelous, thank you very much. I was going to cut some of this excess off because I'm not going to need it. And then also, if you want to save this for like making little pieces or something out of, you totally can. Kind of hard to reclaim that stuff because it'll have a bunch of black slip and all that jazz on it, which I don't really mind on my work if like my clay has little pockets of black or little pockets of white, but it's up to you. Now, when I did the canvas texture removal, I only did it on one side, and that was so that I could get rid of the canvas texture right now, right? I kind of try to fold the edges down a little bit if I can. That'll make my life easier in a minute. So now what I do, this is kind of hard to demonstrate, but I need to make sure my mold is like pretty perfectly centered on my actual spinny boy is what my brain wants to call it. Turntable, we'll call it. Yeah, banging wheel. There we go. Thanks, brain. So you want to get it pretty close to centered on there. And the reason being is because I want to get this spinning pretty fast. You check it out. So it's still off center, pretty hard to one side. So I'll just come in, see where it's kind of off center, and then move it a little bit. Another way you can do this is by tap centering it. So what we'll do is we'll get it spinning, and then I'm gonna, with a really tight hand, try to cut through. I'm not gonna make it all the way through in one go, which is fine, but I have a big enough groove to where I can sort of follow it again. And now I'm just going to slowly but surely cut this. It's all good until I hear it do that scrape sound, and that means I've gone all the way through the clay and I'm hitting plaster. So right there's good. This is my preliminary cut. I'm going to do another one just to make sure I get like a really crisp line. You can save all this stuff for later if you want to. But I have a plate here, right? But my plate's kind of off to one side more than it is the other. So this is kind of a more advanced technique, right? But I need to tap center this. It's the easiest way to get things perfectly on center. So what I do is I keep track of where it's closest to my finger, right? And kind of like a song that has like a beats per minute, right? Like a now, now, now. Almost like you would break up the beats of a song, right? So on this one, I go, it's closest to my finger now, 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 now. And where that now happens, I smack it towards the center, and that, you can see my plate is off-centered now, but my mold is much closer to centered. It's a very like kind of heavy concept to think about, right? But all you're doing is smacking it, and something about it spinning while you smack, the centrifugal force has a tendency to throw it right in the middle, rather than you trying to eyeball stuff all the time, right? So now that I've done that, I can get a perfectly symmetrical circle on the inside edge here too, right? So I'm just going to go in a little bit from my first one. Trying to get something that actually lines up in the middle of my form. Again, spin around until I hear that sound all the way through. Cut this excess off. And now I have a plate that's perfectly centered on this perfectly centered form. All right? So that's how you do a hump mold. This one, a lot of them are flat on the bottom, so you could just be done now, right? And then like in an hour of it sitting outside, you can sort of pop it off and see what the result is. On this one, it doesn't have a flat part, so I need to give it a foot. What I'm gonna do is coil up some of this gunky stuff that I have from my extras, right? And I'm gonna roll it into a coil. Over here. And I'm fine with the fact that it's got like little strips of black and stuff in it. I actually think it kind of connects it to what's going on the other side, right? And I don't need a huge coil because this isn't necessarily a gigantic plate. Something like that will probably do us. So what I'm going to do now is scratch and attach, which we do with everything when we join things, right? Make sure this is pretty close to centered still. There we go. Choose where I want my foot to go. I'm thinking somewhere around here-ish. Scratch that. Scratch one side of my coil. I, for the most part, don't use slip all too often. I actually, most of the time, use just water. And I kind of, water plus scraping usually makes its own slip, you know what I mean? Rather than keeping like a container of slip around all the time. So we'll just keep this nice and moist on both edges. That way we can make some goop for this to attach together with. Cool. So I uncentered it, so let me recenter it by tapping. And then I'm going to take this, I'm going to pinch down, that way I can get this nice and secure. And let's hope we have enough coil to make it all the way around.
And if you didn't?
I would just add another coil, like in the spot that it doesn't overlap. So pinching this down, this will get it kind of secured. Hey, we did have enough, nice. And then I overlap just a little bit, right? Usually I'll do a little bit of scratch attach on that side, push that in, pinch that off, and go from here, right? You could be done there, right? I don't think it's a very even foot. So what I'm gonna do, since I have it on this banding wheel still, I'm gonna take my sponge, and I'm basically gonna do this like kind of Spock motion here. I'm gonna take my sponge, my fingers through there, and I'm gonna push down on either side of the foot to try to center it, and then we can cut it off and make it look a little bit prettier, a little bit more refined. The downside to adding a foot onto a slab like this is your highest point for failure, right? Is where this attachment is. So because I'm using my hand to do this, I can't use two hands. This hand is really locked into my sort of stomach here, and that sort of does, it emulates you having two hands always touching, right? We'll go here, and you can actually do a smidge of like pulling on this too, but I'm really careful and I really compress these corners where my attachment started, right? And then oftentimes I like to do the thing where I like trick people into thinking I threw this plate, because it's one of my most favorite things to do is to make people go like, oh, how do you do that? So in here I'm going to put a little spiral, because a spiral tricks people into thinking that you threw it. I've done this on slipcast work too. It's like a very obviously like a manufactured looking bowl, and I put a spiral in it. People go like, how'd you throw this? It's so great. It is, right? It's crazy. So this looks pretty good. The only downside is that my foot is a little uneven. That happened because I had that overlap spot right where the two parts of the coil overlapped. So I'm going to pull this up a little bit just by sort of pinching those two sides together. That way I can cut some of that off and still have plenty of foot. Let's lubricate this. Do a smidge of the pull. That seems pretty good. And as this is going around, we're going to use my needle tool to get this spinning pretty fast. I'm going to do this just like I would on a thrown piece, right? I cut through until I feel it touch my fingertip. Lift off. Now, we've got a perfectly flat foot. Last thing I'll do is sort of make this not quite so square down here because it looks a little unnatural to me. Sponge this whole thing because we have sponge marks everywhere else. I'm going to do the same kind of Spock thing on the edge here. That way it's not quite so square looking. This also helps kind of refine that shape a little bit and give it some structure. And then if you're ever doing this and you're pulling and things get off center, just take a second and re-center everything. It makes it a lot easier. This whole process is actually much easier if you do it on a wheel, because you don't have to have one hand doing this the whole time, right? A little bit easier for demonstration's sake though. So that's slab work designed on flat and then done on a hump mold, right? I'm going to try to quickly work through doing a slump mold too, but I'll let this dry on here outside for maybe like an hour or two, right? Flip it over and then work on it as if it was a regular plate. Cool. Now I've got my sort of fun spin art thing that I did here, right? Just by having a bunch of slips, putting more slip on, and then adding more slip to that, and then putting it on a bending wheel outside and just spinning it as fast as I could, and it makes everything sort of explode out. And then I did sort of a takeaway with my finger here to get this like nice sort of crisp spiral in the middle. And on that one, I'm going to use one of these ring molds. The same principles apply to ring molds as apply to just regular slump molds, right? There's a couple things you'll need. We got them in here. One of them is a bag of sand. A bag of sand or a bag of beans, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to rough out how much of this I actually need, right? So this is kind of an overkill amount of clay, which isn't the end of the world. So I'm going to set this on here real quick just so I can get kind of an outline. And then I'm going to cut maybe like an inch or two around that. Because that's not perfectly lined up because I'm going to have to stretch that to go into the sort of grooves in there, right? Let me spin this guy around. Try to center this if I can. And tapping it when it feels off. This doesn't have to be perfect because again, this is just a preliminary cut. The real cut comes later. And again, you don't have to save all this stuff. I do, because it feels kind of wasteful to just go like, oh, I guess there's this whole piece of slab that I'm never using again. So now that we've got that lined up, this one's a little trickier, right? Because you have to sort of pick the piece up and lay it into here. The other one's easy because you can just set it down and flip. So I'm going to grab it by a part that I know I'm not going to use, and then lay it in like this. That makes sense. I was like, this seems so much easier. Why wouldn't I do this? So now what I'm going to do, and this is one of the reasons you want all your slip to be dry, right? Is when I hit it with the actual like bag of sand, I don't want it to smear anything that I have done so far, right? So I'm just going to tap this up and down a little bit. That'll start my process, and then I'm going to go in from the center and just work my way out, sort of tamping this in. Sometimes I lift this up, that way air can escape, right? As I work through. And all we're basically doing is like the dry version of like using the sponge to sort of make it fit the mold. And we're using a bag of sand for that. There's some of them that are filled with rice that leave kind of an interesting texture when you pound them. Some of them are filled with beans. They have a similar sort of interesting texture. I just want to make sure this is nice and flush with the curves of the mold.
I just want to emphasize too that notice how he like started in the middle and worked to the outside. That's going to help get all the air out. If you start on the outside and work on the to the inside, you're going to get air trapped in the middle.
Very good point. Very good point. All right, so we've got basically the whole inside sort of mapped out to where it needs to go. I'll then move up a little bit to where that flange is. And then will you do me a favor? Will you grab me the wire tool that we use to cut the edges of the molds? So we've got a couple different versions of this. It's basically just like a cheese wire. You can buy them at Highwater. Like most things, there's a like normal version and then there's a fancy pottery version that costs like $27. I'm going to use the fancy pottery $27 one because it's one of the few occasions where it actually works much better. No, I want the good one. So, case in point, right? Fancy pottery version, and then like one you can get at like a dollar store potentially, right? They both do the same thing. This one's just fancier. It's got a nicer handle and it's blue. Wow. So I'm just going to spend another second really trying to make sure I'm lined up on the edge up here. Another thing too, so if this wasn't totally dry, as I was pounding this, I would be the most dramatic metal sound. As I was pounding this, it would be stealing color away from the actual piece, right? If this was still moist. Sometimes you get these like little cracks going on up top. I don't mind those, again, because I usually inlay most of my pieces with some kind of black into any sort of crack or crevice, then I really actually kind of enjoy that, right? So now that that's done, what I'm going to do is cut this until I hit the edge of my mold. Spin it around, trying to do it in one smooth motion if I can, but I can't because I hit the square thing there. I'll be hitting another part of the square thing. Let's see. It helps sometimes if the edge here isn't super long, right? So I'm just going to do some preliminary cuts to make it a little bit shorter. Here I should be able to. Usually it goes much smoother than this. Again, square. Ugh. Should have put this on a bat, right? A bat would have been the best case scenario for this. But I'll do another round of this just to make sure I end up with one sort of smooth, continuous curve. Because it's really easy to like pitch this in a different direction, right? And then it doesn't quite look as good. So I'm just going to use a rib for that. Maybe mine as well. We use one of these. Just scrape that edge nice and flush with that other edge. And that is our Slump Mold version of a decorated flat slab.